The indicator changed while Sevhel was counting his own heartbeats. He had been doing this for 3 watches now, a trick he'd learned on the crossing to Francia, when the steersman had taught him to measure the interval between waves by the blood in his own wrist. 42 beats between the slow pulse of the display's sweep. 42 beats, the light moved. 42 beats, the light moved again, the rhythm of a thing that did not know it was being watched. He sat in the position the Roman had assigned him, second seat from the left on the raised tier, the one that gave him sight lines to both the main display and the corridor entrance. 5 days of watches, and Sevhel had learned the bridge, the way he'd learned any ship, the geometry, not the workings, where you could see from, where you could not, which surfaces would take weight if you needed to brace, which panels were cosmetic and would give way under a shoulder. The bridge of the Arvith was 3 times the size of any longship's deck, but a deck was a deck. You learned the footing first, everything else came from the footing. The display swept again. 42 beats. Sevhel had not slept in. He did not know exactly. The watches blurred. The Roman had set the rotation at 4 shifts, paired with the freed creatures whose scales caught the bridge lighting in ways that made the air seem to shimmer. Sevhel's shift partner was one of the triple-jointed ones, the tallest, who communicated mostly through a posture language Sevhel was beginning to parse. Weight forward meant attention, weight back meant routine, and the sideways tilt of their narrow head meant amusement, though he could not have said why he was sure of that. His shift partner was in the back weight position now. Routine. Sevhel watched the display sweep. The light moved, and this time, between 42 and 43, something else moved with it. A second indicator, small, at the edge of the display where the sweep thinned into darkness. It does not be there on the last pass. Sevhel was certain of this because he had been staring at the exact spot where it appeared, counting the emptiness there as part of his rhythm. 42 heartbeats of empty, and now occupied. He did not know what the indicator meant. The display's markings were the flat, angular script of the ship's builders, and while the Romani woman had taught him 7 or 8 of the most common symbols, warning, door, breathe, do not touch, the navigation display used none of those. What he knew was simpler. The indicator was new, and it was moving. His shift partner's weight had come forward. Sevhel looked at the creature. Its segmented eyes were focused on the same spot he'd been watching, and its long triple-jointed legs had shifted into a stance Sevhel recognized from 5 days of shared watches, the one that preceded every corridor seal notification, every time the ship's systems had done something unexpected. The creature's head was not tilted in amusement. Its head was very still. Sevhel stood. He did not run. Running on a ship meant something was already wrong. Walking fast meant you were going to find out what was about to be. He could walk to the corridor that led to the berth section where the tracker slept. Pakla was awake before he reached her. She slept the way Sevhel had seen steppe hunters sleep on the Frankish coast, one layer down from consciousness, surfacing at the pressure change of a footstep in her corridor. By the time he stopped at the partition she'd rigged from cargo netting, she was already sitting up, her dark eyes fixed on his face with the flat attention of someone reading weather. Display, Sevhel said in the combined trade words they shared. He held up one finger, then 2, one indicator, then 2. The tracker did not ask questions. She pulled on the wrapped foot coverings she'd fashioned from cargo material and followed him back to the bridge at a pace just short of running. A triple-jointed creature was still in its forward weight stance when they arrived. It shifted toward Pakla and made a sound, low, resonant, the one Sevhel had categorized as "look at this." Pakla looked. The change in her body was immediate and total. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Her breathing slowed. Her weight settled into her heels like someone planting themselves against a gust that hadn't arrived yet. Sevhel had learned this posture over 5 days of watches. The tracker had seen something she did not like, and she was giving it absolute stillness before deciding what to do about it. How long? She asked, in the pidgin of combined words and hand gestures that served as their common language. Sevhel held up 2 fingers and made the gesture for sweep, the display's rotation. 2 passes since the indicator appeared. Pakla leaned closer to the display. Her eyes tracked the indicator's position relative to the Arva's own marker, and Sevhel watched her lips move as she worked through a calculation he could not follow. Then she straightened up and crossed the bridge to the communications alcove where the modern woman slept when she slept at all, which was seldom enough. Sevhel heard Pakla's voice, low and urgent. Then the modern woman's voice, sharp with the alertness of someone jolted from thin sleep. Dika arrived at the display 14 seconds later. Sevhel knew because he was counting. "Recovery team," Dika said. She said it in the language Sevhel did not speak, the modern tongue, and then in combined trade words. "Fast ship, coming for us. Kamado or Singh." Sevhel looked at the indicator. It had moved closer in the time since Pakla had first seen it. The display's scale was enormous, and the indicator's shift was barely perceptible between sweeps, but the direction was unmistakable, toward them. Aimda. A ship that does not vary its approach is a ship that expects no response, Sevhel. He had been on ships where the approach was everything, where you read the angle of the incoming vessel and knew, from the way it sat in the water and the timing of its oar strokes, whether it was coming to trade or to kill. Both were dangerous, but the ship that expected no response was the most dangerous of all, because it meant the crew had done this so many times that surprise was not in their experience. He had never in his life been on a ship that expected no response. Something was always throwing a rope or an axe. "How fast?" Pakla asked. Deka was working at the console, her fingers moving through the angular script with the speed of someone who had spent 8 days forcing her mind into an alien grammar. "Faster than us." "Smaller, designed for this intercept and recovery. It's a very expensive net." Pakla looked at Sevhel. He understood the look. "What do you see?" "It turns," he said. He pointed at the display. "Same pause, same turn. I have been counting." Both women looked at him. 42, he said, and held up fingers. "Then it adjusts." He made the gesture, a slight shift, the same direction each time, a correction that repeated with mechanical precision. He had been watching it without knowing what he was watching, and now that the women had given him the context, recovery ship, intercept heading faster, the pattern snapped into the shape of something he recognized. It was a patrol route, a patrol. The recovery ship was running the same search pattern a Frankish coast watch ran when it swept a harbor mouth for raiders. Fixed arc, fixed interval, fixed correction. The route you ran when you believed the thing you were looking for could not possibly be looking back. "Incompletely HFY," Deka asked. Sevhel tapped his wrist, heartbeats. Then he held up the piece of cargo netting scrap he'd been using to track the intervals, where he'd been scratching marks with the edge of a broken fastener. 16 marks in neat rows of 4. 16 sweeps observed, 16 identical intervals. Pakla took the scrap from his hand and studied it. Then she looked at Deka. "Fixed cycle," Pakla said. Her voice was quiet, focused, already moving ahead of the present moment. A hunter who had found spoor. "It runs the same approach every time. Like a river in a worn channel. It does not vary because it has never needed to." Deka stared at the scrap, then at the display, then at Pakla. Something shifted in her face. "I can use this." "The Combine doesn't expect cargo to know what an approach algorithm is," Deka said. "The ship is running automated intercept, a standard recovery pattern. It cycles its sensor sweep on a fixed interval because every other time it's done this, the target was a disabled vessel drifting on a predictable heading." "We are not drifting," Sevhel said. "No," Deka said. "We are not." The next 6 hours were the longest Sevhel had spent on a ship since the 3-day crossing to Miklagard, when the currents had fought them the entire way, and the steersman had slept standing up with his hand on the tiller. Dika worked the navigation console with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery. Pakla stood at the display and tracked the recovery ship's pattern, calling out each cycle in the pidgin they'd developed. Turn now, correct now, sweep now. Sevhel watched from his position and counted. The plan was Deka's, built from the patterns Sevhel had identified. If the recovery ship's sensor sweep operated on a fixed cycle, there were gaps, moments when the sweep had passed and the recovery ship's systems were blind to a particular arc of sky. If the Arveth changed course during those gaps, quick, sharp adjustments that shifted their position before the next sweep came around, they could thread through the intervals like a small boat slipping past a harbor chain at the change of the tide. Sevhel understood the principle. He had done this in water. The fact that it worked in the void between stars, with machines instead of oars and light instead of waves, changed nothing about the fundamental mechanics. You moved when the watcher's eye was elsewhere, and you were still before it came back. The first course change came 40 minutes into the evasion. Deka called it. The ship lurched, enough that Sevhel felt it in his legs, the subtle shift in the floor's vibration that meant the engines had changed their song. On the display, the Arveth's marker moved, a sharp lateral adjustment angled away from the recovery ship's projected sweep path. The recovery ship's indicator continued on its cycle. Sweep, pause, correct, the same pattern. It had not seen them move. Sevhel exhaled. He had not been aware he was holding his breath. The Roman arrived on the bridge during the second hour, drawn by the activity or by the instinct that brought commanders to the place where things were happening. He took one look at the display, received Pakla's terse explanation, and positioned himself behind Deka's station with the stillness of someone who understood that the person at the console was the person in command, and the best thing he could do was be present and silent. Sevhel respected this more than he would have expected. Hattori appeared next, silent as smoke, and stood at the bridge's far edge where he could see everything and be seen by nothing. The strategist's presence was its own reassurance. It meant the political angles were being tracked alongside the physical ones. The second course change came at the 3-hour mark. Deka had timed it to the heartbeat. The Arveth shifted, harder this time, a course correction that Sevhel felt in his knees, and the display showed their markers sliding through a gap in the recovery ship's sweep pattern, like a fish through a broken weir. The recovery ship's cycle completed and then changed. Sevhel saw it in the display before anyone else because he had been counting, and the count was wrong. The interval between the recovery ship's sweep and its correction had shortened, 3 heartbeats, maybe 4. But the pattern that had been mechanical, unvarying, identical across 16 observed cycles, had altered. It worthiest, and he said. Every head on the bridge turned to him. The last sweep was shorter, he said. He held up his scrap of netting, where the newest mark was scratched noticeably closer to the previous one. 3 beats. It is looking faster now. Deka's fingers were already moving across the console. Its face had the expression Sevhel associated with someone recalculating under fire, the focused speed of a mind that had just been told the ground rules had shifted. After 30 seconds during which Sevhel could hear his own pulse, she spoke. The algorithm adapted. The crew doesn't know the algorithm changed. There's about a 30-second gap between what the ship decides and what the crew knows it decided. Sevhel processed this. The ship thought faster than its own sailors. He had never served on a vessel where that was true, but he understood the implication immediately. The ship would adjust first, and the crew would catch up later, and in that catching up was a seam. But the seam was secondary. The thing hunting them was no longer running a fixed patrol. It was reacting, and anything that reacted to you was a different kind of threat than anything that simply searched for you. Then change what it is looking at, Sevhel said. Give it the wrong C. Deka looked at him, her brow creased, the expression she made when she was translating not just his words, but the concept underneath them, mapping it from the language of water and wood onto the language of sensors and void. The wrong C, she repeated. If a current reader adjusts to follow you, Sevhel said, choosing his words carefully, using the pigeon's limited vocabulary and filling the gaps with gestures, you do not run faster, you make the current lie, you give it something to read that is not you. Dika's eyes went wide with recognition. So to take him down to the console that and began working at a mayday, a bekingness of Sevhel could not follow, her fingers drawing patterns in the angular script that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant something to the ship. The transponder profile, she muttered, half to herself. We already changed the identity, but the mass signature, the drive output ratio, the thermal profile, those are all still reading as a harvest ship, because they are a harvest ship. She looked at Pakla. If I adjust the drive output to stagger, pulse it irregularly instead of steady state, the algorithm will read us as something different, something it hasn't categorized. And he thought will that work? Pakla asked. It will confuse the algorithm for about 20 minutes while it recalculates, Deka said. In that 20 minutes, the crew won't know why their approach calculations have changed, because the algorithm doesn't explain itself, it just updates. They'll have to manually review before they can resume intercept. Omain Tinnis, the Roman said, from behind Deka's station. It was the first word he'd spoken. Enough? Reek? Deka looked at the display. The recovery ship was close enough now that Sevhel could see the fine details of its approach vector on the overlay, a predator's geometry, tightening, with one more course change timed to the implementation window, enough to open a gap they can't close before whatever's keeping them on this heading changes. Do it, the Roman said. Deka's hands moved. The ship's vibration changed, irregular, stuttering, a heartbeat that had learned to lie about its own rhythm. Sevhel felt it in the soles of his feet and recognized it as the deliberate wrongness that made a steersman adjust his read on the current. You could not fight the sea, but you could make the sea fight itself. On the display, the recovery ship's indicator hesitated, a tiny thing, a delay in the sweep cycle that lasted no longer than a breath. But Sevhel had been counting for 6 hours, and he knew what hesitation looked like in a pattern that had never hesitated before. The recovery ship's algorithm had been fed something it did not expect, and for one brief, beautiful moment, it was uncertain. Now, Sevhel said, Deka made the third course change. The Arveth lurched hard, harder than before, hard enough that Sevhel braced against his station and felt the ship groan in a register that suggested something structural was displeased with the maneuver. But the marker moved, through the gap, past the recovery ship's projected sweep arc, into a patch of display that was dark and empty and blessedly unmonitored. The recovery ship's indicator began a new sweep, but the sweep was wrong. The interval had changed again, and the direction was off by several degrees, and the pattern had the jagged quality of a system trying to reacquire a target it had been confident about 30 seconds ago, and was no longer confident about at all. Sevhel watched it search. He counted. 1 cycle, 2, 3, 4, each one different from the last. The mechanical precision was gone. The patrol route was gone. The recovery ship was hunting now, genuinely hunting, and the difference between a patrol and a hunt was that a hunt meant you had lost the thing you were looking for. 20 minutes passed. Deka sat rigid at the console, her eyes fixed on the display, her hands hovering over the controls with the coiled readiness of someone waiting for the moment when everything went wrong. Pakla stood at the display and tracked every sweep, murmuring intervals to no one in particular. The Roman was a statue of controlled attention behind them both. Sevhel counted. The recovery ship stopped hunting at the 6-hour and 40-minute mark. Sevhel saw it happen in real time. The indicator, which had been running erratic search patterns for the past hour, straightened away from them. A clean course change, smooth and mechanical, the algorithm reverting to purposeful transit, new instructions received. The recovery ship was leaving. Sevhel watched it go. The indicator shrank at the edge of the display, moving with the steady certainty of a vessel that had somewhere to be and was no longer interested in them. It did not pause, it did not sweep, it turned and left, like a hound called back by a whistle no one on the bridge could hear. The thing left the display. He did not know why. He knew it was not coming back today. That was enough. He uncrossed his arms, crossed them again, looked at the scrap of cargo netting in his hand, covered in scratched marks, 32 cycles tracked, the last dozen erratic and uneven, a record of a machine learning that its prey was not prey. He set the scrap down on his station. He would not need it again for this. Around the bridge, the tension drained in stages. Dika slumped forward over the console and pressed both palms flat against its surface, her shoulders dropping as the held breath focus of the past 7 hours released all at once. Atkular stepped back from the display and rolled her neck with the deliberate slowness of someone whose muscles had been locked in position for far too long. The triple-jointed creature, Sevhel's shift partner, settled from its forward-weight stance into something that looked very much like relief, its narrow head tilting sideways, in the posture Sevhel had decided was amusement. Ittori materialized from his position at the bridge's edge and exchanged a glance with the Roman that contained an entire conversation Sevhel could not read but understood the conclusion of. "We survived this one." Sevhel went back to his watch position, second seat from the left, sidelines to the display in the corridor. He sat. He resumed counting his heartbeats. 42, 42, 42. The rhythm of a bridge that was no longer being hunted. 20 minutes later, Pakla said something from the display that made Deka look up. Sevhel watched the tracker trace a line on the display with one finger, the boundary she had identified days ago, the edge of the region the Combine had marked as territory it did not enter. The Arveth's marker was approaching that line, crossing it now as he watched, the ship's indicator sliding across the invisible threshold like a boat passing from river into open sea. On the far side of the line, the display changed. Sevhel had been watching this display for 5 days, and he noticed the angular script annotations that the Combine had scattered across their charts, navigation markers, warning beacons, administrative notations that the Romani woman had translated as things like survey pending and resource extraction scheduled. Those annotations thinned. They thinned like trees at a timberline, growing sparser and smaller until the display ahead of them was mostly dark, mostly empty, mostly unknown. The Combine knew these stars existed. That much was clear from the display. The stars were charted, named in the angular script, given coordinates and relative positions, but the annotations around them were threadbare. No survey data, no extraction schedules, no administrative markers, just coordinates and silence. The modern woman was staring at the star field ahead with the expression she got when she'd found a system she didn't understand, focused in the way of someone whose mind had identified a problem worth solving, and was already 3 steps into the work. The Roman came to stand beside her. He looked at the display, at the thinning markers, at the dark expanse opening ahead of them. His face was unreadable in the way it always was. A man who had spent decades commanding other men, and had learned that the commander's face was a tool, not a window. Past this point, Deka said, the Combine's charts get sparse. They know these stars exist. They don't know much about what's around them. The Roman considered this. Sevhel watched him, watched the slight shift in his weight, the way his jaw set, the almost imperceptible nod that was acknowledgement, not agreement. The Roman was calculating something. He was always calculating something. "That means we know as much as they do," the Roman said. Deka looked at him, the faintest trace of a smile, the first Sevhel had seen from her since the recovery ship had appeared on the display 7 hours ago. "That's exactly what I mean," she said. Sevhel looked at the stars ahead. They were not the stars he had grown up under, not the Great Bear, not the Pole Star, not any configuration he had ever used to find his way home, but they were stars, and they were ahead, and the thing that had been chasing them was behind and gone. For a man who had spent his life on the water, that was a navigable situation. You did not need to know where you were going. You needed to know that you were moving and that the sea behind you was empty. The sea behind them was empty. The Arvet flew on, past the last thinning marker, into the dark that the Combine had labeled but never entered. Sevhel counted his heartbeats. 42, 42, 42. The rhythm held, the stars moved, and ahead of them the unknown spread like open water past the last headland, vast and unmarked, and waiting for someone to learn its currents. He settled into his seat and watched.